Chapter 2. Furlong had come from nothing, less than nothing, some might say. His mother, at the age of 16, had fallen pregnant while working as a domestic for Mrs. Wilson, the Protestant widow who lived in the big house a few miles outside of town. When his mother's trouble became known, and her people made it clear that they have no more to do with her, Mrs. Wilson, instead of giving his mother her walking papers, told her she should stay on and keep her work. On the morning Furlong was born, it was Mrs. Wilson who had his mother taken into hospital and had them brought home. It was the 1st of April, 1946, and some said the boy would turn out to be a fool. The main of Furlong's infancy was spent in a Moses basket in Miss Wilson's kitchen, and he was then harnessed into the big prawn beside the dresser, just out of reach of the long blue jugs. His earliest memories were of serving plates, a black range, hot, hot, and a shining floor of square tiles made of 2 colors, on which he crawled and later walked and later still learned, resembled a draught's board whose pieces either jumped over others or were taken. As he grew, Miss Wilson, who had no children of her own, took him under her wings, gave him little jobs, and helped him along with his reading. She had a small library and didn't seem to care much for what judgments others passed, but carried temperately along with her own life, living off the pension she received on account of her husband having been killed in the war. And what income that came from her small herd of well-minded Herefords and Cheviots ewes. Ned, the farmhand, lived in too, and seldom was there much friction around the place or with neighbors, as the land was well fenced and managed, and no money was owing. Neither was there much tension over religious beliefs, which on both sides were lukewarm. On Sunday, Mrs. Wilson simply changed her dress and shoes, pinned her good hat onto her head, and was driven as far as the church by Ned in the Ford, which was then driven a little farther on with mother and child to the chapel. And when they returned home, both prayer books and the Bible were left lying on the hall stand until the following Sunday or holy day. As a schoolboy, Furlong had been jeered and called some ugly names. Once he'd come home with the back of his coat covered in spit. But his connection with the big house had given him some leeway and protection. He had gone on to the technical school for a couple of years before winding up at the coal yard, doing much the same work as his own men now did under him, and had worked his way up. He'd a head for business and was known for getting along and could be relied upon, as he had developed good Protestant habits, was given to rising early, and had no taste for drink. Now he lived in the town with his wife, Eileen, and their 5 daughters. He'd met Eileen while she was working in the office of Graves and Company, and had courted her in the usual ways, taking her to the cinema and for long walks along the tow paths in the evening. He was attracted to her shiny black hair and slate eyes, her practical, agile mind. When they engaged to marry, Miss Wilson gave Furlong a few £1,000s to start up. Some said she had given him money because it was one of her own that had fathered him. Sure, hadn't he been Christian William after the Kings? But Furlong never had found out who his father was. His mother had died suddenly, kneeled over the cobblestones one day, kneeling a barrel of crab apples up to the house, wheeling a barrel of crab apples up to the house to make jelly. A bleeding to the brain was what the doctors had called it afterwards. Furlong was 12 at the time. Years later, when he'd gone into the registry office for a copy of his birth certificate, unknown was all that was written in the space where his father's name might have been. The clerk's mouth had bent into an ugly smile, handing it out to him over the counter. Now Furlong was disinclined to dwell on the past. His attention was fixed on providing for his girls, who were black hair like Eileen and fairly complexion. Already they were showing promise in school. Kathleen, his eldest, came in with him to the little prefabricated office on Saturdays, and for pocket money helped out with the books, and was able to file what had come in during the week and keep an account of most things. Joanne, too, had a good head on her shoulders and had recently joined the choir. Both were now attending secondary at St. Margaret's. The middle child, Sheila, and the second youngest, Grace, who'd been born 11 months apart, could recite the multiplication tables off by heart, do long division, and name the counties and rivers of Ireland, which they sometimes traced out and colored in with markers at the kitchen table. They, too, were musically inclined and were taking accordion lessons up at the convent on Tuesdays after school. Loretta, their youngest, although shy of people, was getting gold and silver stars on her copybooks, reading her way through Enid Blyton, and had won a Texaco prize for her drawing of a fat blue hen skating across a frozen pond. Sometimes Furlong, seeing the girls going through the small things which needed to be done, genuflecting in the chapel or thanking a shopkeeper for the change, felt a deep, private joy that these children were his own. "Aren't we the lucky ones?" he remarked to Eileen in bed one night. "There's many out there badly off. We are surely. Not that we've much," he said, "but still." Eileen's hand slowly pushed a crease out of the bedspread. "Did something happen?" It took him a moment to answer. Mick, Sinot's little chap, was out on the road again today, foraging for sticks. "I suppose you stopped." "Wasn't it spilling rain? I pulled over and offered him a lift and gave him what bit of a change was loose in my pocket. I dare say. You'd think it was £100 I'd given him." You know, some of these bring the hardships on themselves. 'Tis not the child's doing, surely. Sinat was statious at the phone box on Tuesday. The poor man, Furlong said. Whatever ails him? Drink is what ails him. If he'd any regard for his children, he'd not be going around like that. He pulled himself out of it. Maybe the man isn't able, I suppose. She'd reach over and sighed, turn out the light. Always there's one that has to pull the short straw. Some nights Furlong lay there with Eileen, going over small things like these. Other times, after a day of heavy lifting, or being delayed by a puncture and getting soaked out on the road, he'd come home and eat his fill and fall into bed early. Then wake in the night sensing Eileen, heavy in sleep at his side. And then there he'd lie with his mind going round in circles, agitating, before finally he'd have to go down and put the kettle on for tea. He'd stand at the window, then with the cup in his hand, looking down at the streets and what he could see of the river, at the little bits and pieces of going on, stray dogs out foraging for scraps in the bins, chipper bags and empty cans being rolled and blown roughly about the driving wind and rain, stragglers from the pub stumbling home. Sometimes these stumbling men sang a little. Other times Furlong would hear a sharp, hot whistle and laughter, which made him tense. He imagined his girls getting big and growing up, going out into that world of men. Already he'd seen men's eyes following his girls, but some part of his mind was often tense. He could not say why. It would be the easiest thing in the world to lose everything, Furlong knew. Although he did not venture far, he got around, and many an unfortunate he'd seen around town and out the country roads. The dole queues were getting longer, and there were men out there who couldn't pay their ESB bills, living in houses no warmer than bunkers, sleeping in their overcoats. Women on the first Friday of every month lined up at the post office wall with shopping bags waiting to collect their children's allowances. And further out the country, he'd known cows to be left bawling, to be milked, because the man who had their care had upped suddenly and taken the boat to England. Once a man from St. Mullins got a lift into town to pay his bill, saying that he'd had to sell the Jeep as they couldn't get a wink of sleep knowing what was owing, that the bank was coming down on them. And early one morning, Furlong had seen a young schoolboy drinking the milk out of the cat's bowl behind the priest's house. While making the rounds, Furlong seldom listened to the radio, but he sometimes tuned in and caught the news. It was 1985, and the young people were immigrating, leaving for London and Boston, New York. A new airport had just opened at Knock in Mayo. The Taoish had signed an agreement with Thatcher over the north, and the Unionists in Belfast were out marching with drums, protesting over Dublin having any say in their affairs. The crowds down in Cork and Kerry were thinning out, but some still were gathering at the shrines in the hope that one of the statues might move again. In New Ross, the shipyard company had closed, and Albatross, the big fertilizer factory on the far side of the river, had made several redundancies. Bennett's had let 11 employees go, and Graves and Company, where Eileen had worked, which had been there for as long as anyone could remember, had closed their doors. The auctioneer said business was stone cold, that he might as well be trying to sell ice to the Eskimos. And Miss Kenny, the florist whose shop was near the coal yard, had boarded up her window and had asked one of Furlong's men to hold the plywood steady for her one evening while she drove the nails. The times were raw, but Furlong felt all the more determined to carry on, to keep his head down and stay on the right side of people, and to keep providing for his girls and seeing them getting on and completing their education at St. Margaret's, the only good for girls in the town. End of chapter 2.